Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Introducing the Next Step in Cybersecurity Evolution. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. Today's webinar will last for approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for your questions. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. The control panel is situated on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send these questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect your questions and address these during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Following the webinar, we will send you the recording of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce you to our presenter, Uri Bar-El, Senior VP and Head of Qualitest Cybersecurity. So over to you, Uri.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar. Briefly about me, I've been doing cybersecurity for over 20 years now, mainly in the UK, but also out of Israel and the US. And most recently, I've built security practices. That's what I've been doing in the last 5 years. What I wanted to talk about today is how cybersecurity should change in order for it to fit for its current purposes and tasks. And in order to do that, I would first like to discuss the domain dynamics that we see. And by saying domain dynamics, I tend to divide it into what I call positive dynamics and negative dynamics. So if we start with the positive dynamics on the upper part of the screen, we see first of all the biggest force that we have been seeing for the last 5 years, which is the user awareness level. And when I say user awareness level, I mean the end users. People today expect to have security as a core part of their product or solution, be it social media, online banking, or whatever it is. People are aware of security issues and demand for a secure product. And that is a very big change, especially for organizations who provide solutions and products to end consumers. And I think today most organizations are very much dependent on the end user. So the increase in user level has made it a very important part of product development. And as you can see in the middle of the screen, it has put security as a business imperative and hence also a board level concern. What used to be a nice to have or even maybe a niche issue to handle, if we look at it 10 years ago, today it is known that without security practices in place and security assurances in place, customers will find it difficult to adopt products and services. And that's one very big dynamic we see in the domain. Another very important dynamic is regulation pressure. Regulation has always been around in terms of information security or cybersecurity. However, it did not usually have the teeth to really penalize companies who did not follow the regulation. GDPR has been a very, very dramatic change to that situation, and we see that GDPR in Europe and some equivalents in the US are now turning to be more aggressive regulation, putting a lot of pressure on organizations, and today becoming regulation ready is again an extremely important thing for companies and especially for board levels. A third dynamic that we've seen it for a while now and it's still there, is digitization processes. Many organizations have had to modernize their services and their solution and to be able to access their clients in a much more direct manner. Digitization processes are something that we've been seeing cross sectors, from finance through tobacco companies, where they are moving from selling B2B, 4 big deals a year, into selling B2C, their electronic cigarettes. So the digitization process that we've been seeing is a very, very strong dynamic in pushing security up in its importance level, because the more we digitize our processes and our services, the more we expose them to the outside, the more the attack surface increases. The last one that we see on the top right corner is the increased dependency that we have on technology. And I don't remember which survey it was, and I'm not even sure how real it was, but it was interesting for me to read it, that these 3 icons, low Wi-Fi, low reception, and low battery, are the things that scare youth the most today. So these are the 3 icons that gives people the chills. And other than it being a joke, it also have a very serious side to it, because the dependency that we have today on services, on digital services, and on their availability, it's becoming more and more similar to water in our taps, because we can get along without water in our taps, but it's very difficult. And if a day goes by, it becomes even more difficult. So just think about how many services you use on a daily basis, whether these are core services, your internet banking, your insurance, etc., or even if those are social media outlets, and how important these are in many of our lives. So the increased dependency that we see on online services, on digital services, are another dynamic that eventually causes cybersecurity to become, as we said, both a business imperative and a board level concern. So these are the positive dynamics that we've been seeing in the last 5 years or so, mainly in the last 5 years. There are, however, some negative dynamics, if you'd like. One of them is the shift in motivation. And we see the mask here, and I don't know who remembers the Anonymous group, but if we look 7 or 10 years ago, the main motivation for hackers was social, or we used to call them hacktivists. It wasn't about the money. Whereas today, the motivation is purely about the money. The hacking industry, if you'd like, is a very well-financed industry and a very well-organized industry, mainly controlled by old-school organized crime organizations, which identified that online vulnerabilities, I would say, or online opportunities are much more lucrative than the opportunities that they are currently pursuing. They identified that the resources are there for the taking, and what we are seeing in the last 5 years, and even a little bit more, is a very strong shift towards a very organized industry that is fully motivated by money. And when things are fully motivated by money, they become that much more dangerous. A very strong example that I like to use is, if we look at hackers 7 or 10 years ago, nobody had it in their mind to hack into a hospital and damage the services that can be given to patients. Whereas today we see that hospitals and medical devices and everything to do with healthcare is a prime target for these hackers, because they understand that these targets are the easiest to pay in order to maintain the availability of their systems or the confidentiality of their patients. And again, this has to do with the shift in motivation from hacktivism, if you'd like, and towards purely financial motivations. The other 2 parts that we see at the bottom of the screen, the resources availability and the shift in the required skill set, they usually come together. If in order to be a hacker a decade ago, you needed to have a very unique skill set and you needed to find your way on how to do it, or really define this process, today online resources in terms of tools and guides are very much present, And in order to become a hacker, all you need is to actually have enough research done and follow enough of these guides, and you will become, you will have the beginners at least level. Now that does not mean that the hackers are not as sophisticated as before, but what we do see is that the proliferation or number of attacks has increased so dramatically that organizations are now required to deal with those lower level concerns and not have enough resources to deal with the future facing issues. And this is a big part of the negative forces that we've been seeing in the last 5 to 7 years. I want to spend just 1 minute on these statistics. 90% of statistics are incorrect. That's what they say. And in the cyber domain, we see so many different statistics in terms of the size of the market, the number of incidents that happen, etc. But there is one number, one statistic that have been consistent throughout recent years. And we've seen these statistics, and it's not always been the one that we focused on. However, for me, this is the most important statistic for the cybersecurity industry because it depicts the problem that will happen also 5 years from now and 10 years from now if we keep doing things the same way we've been doing them all these years. And that's the predicted global shortfall of 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs by 2021, which is around the corner. This number is amazing because what it essentially says is that we will not have enough police to catch the thieves. And the more we progress over the years, this number has increased and again been proven correct over the years. And if we keep doing things the way we do, and because of the forces that we mentioned earlier, the attack surface will increase dramatically. The bad guys will invest enough resources in order to keep themselves ahead of the curve all the time, and we will play catch for a long time because of these dynamics that we see. And that's why for me this is the statistic that makes or the most important statistic for me. This was also the statistic that I used when I created the set of solutions here in Qualitest. Let's talk a little bit about 3 questions that I would like us to cover in this webinar. One is the evolution of the CISO role. That's one thing that I would like us to discuss. The second is who should do security testing. Is it something that we should leave in the hands of testing experts, or is this something that should remain at the hands of the cybersecurity experts? These are 2 key questions that I would like us to ask. The third question that I would like us to ask is how do we solve this problem of security as an outsider? Okay, and I'll explain soon. Let's start with the evolution of the CISO role. 20 years ago when I started getting into this domain, then it wasn't called cyber, it was data security, information security, computer security, and then a marketing genius decided to call it cybersecurity and it all blew up again. But when we started 20 years ago, the role of the information security or the responsibility for information security was at the hands of the physical security officer. Usually, let's take the financial industry as an example, the same person responsible for the physical security of the bank, the branches, etc., had the responsibility to secure the data of the bank. Why? Mainly because it had the same word security in there. But the more the data security domain or information security domain evolved, the easier it was to understand that the skill set required was different between physical security and data security. And the role of the Chief Information Security Officer was born. The role of the Information Security Officer was born and split from the Physical Security Officer. What we are experiencing now, in my opinion, is a very similar situation because the CISO's role is very much focused on securing the organization. It has been so for a long time now. And the increase or huge changes that we've been seeing in product development were not matched by the CISO's role and organization. So the CISO kept focusing on corporate security, which require a very distinct set of technology, skills, know-how, and methodologies, whereas product development requires a completely different set of skills, technologies, know-how, and methodologies. And now what I'm suggesting should happen is another divergence, where the role of the CISO will be split into two. One is responsible for corporate security, and we all know over this webinar, we are all in this industry, and we know how much technologies and how very well-defined skill set is required in order to protect the corporate side of things. And that would be one side of the CISO's role. And this other side, the completely different skill set required and technology, will be around product development. So the CISO will be able to provide the value that their organization is providing now, but in a different aspects. And currently, we don't see that happening. Another point that I would like to discuss and to understand its role in why security is left behind a little bit in product security, or why it is not providing as much value as it should, is the fact that security still till today is an outsider. Even if it is done within the organization, the security organization is in most cases an outsider to the development process. As long as security is considered or is an outsider to the development process, they will always be considered as part of the problem rather than the solution. There is also a very important consequence for security being an outsider to the development process. And that consequence is around accountability. Because let's take DevOps. What DevOps actually means to us is that accountability is now very much focused. We know who is responsible for the product's quality, let's say. But then comes security, and again, in most cases, dictate what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and it dictates it as an outsider to the process. So what we see in organizations, large and small, we see that accountability is in essence being shared, because the product quality's responsibility is very well defined. But security, you told us what to do, you brought in your pen testers, we fixed what you had to, what you said we need to fix, and that's it. That's not our responsibility anymore. And that is a very big problem, because as we said before, we all understand that today security is a core, let's say, functionality in a product. It's a core requirement from any product, and that's why the accountability for the level of security within a product should lie within the same team that is responsible for the availability of this product and for any other aspect of product quality. So the last 2 points brings us to a question: who needs to do testing? And I'll explain. Testing for security vulnerabilities. And I will explain. Again, going back 10 years ago, in order to identify security vulnerability, you needed to have a very specific mindset. You needed to be able to think outside the box, to try and identify all sorts of different methods to bypass the logic of the system, to bypass technological restrictions that you had in order to identify a way to break a system. This has been an art more than a science since I would say the beginning of cybersecurity. However, if we look at this today, then finding an SQL injection or identifying a cross-site scripting or CSRF attack it has become a much more mainstream activities. There are tools and methodologies and very well-defined ways to identify those, let's call them top 10 vulnerability lists, right? And on one hand, we are asking the cybersecurity experts to think outside the box, to be forward-facing, to really understand the next level of technologies and how to protect them. But on the other hand, we are asking cybersecurity experts to have the consistency and to have the methodical approach of going test after test, input field after input field, and testing for these very, again, well-known, well-defined vulnerabilities. So in essence, we are asking the same people for two very distinct and very different skill sets. Now, if you remember, we mentioned the 3.5 million shortfall, and that ties very, very tightly into this question of who needs to do the testing, the cybersecurity testing, because let's take large cybersecurity testing firms. There will be 200 people there. And let's take a long penetration test or security review process. It will be 2 weeks. It will be a month. There will be a team of 5. And this is a really large and long penetration test process or security review process. The coverage that we are able to attain if we give cybersecurity experts the task of testing for these very well-known vulnerabilities will be much smaller than if we gave it to the testing experts, because the testing experts, that's what they've been doing for the last 20 years. They perfected method to test to the greatest coverage possible issues that are understandable. And now cybersecurity, in my opinion, should move towards this very well-known testing domain, very established testing domain, and let's teach our security engineers or testing engineers, let's teach them security on top of their testing expertise. That will get us the volumes that we need, the coverage that we need, the consistency in results, which has been one of the biggest issues with cybersecurity testing till today. And if we put all this work, all this mainstream, well-known work at the hands of testing experts, will give our security experts the freedom and the time to really invest themselves in getting this domain much more progressed, getting this domain much more forward-looking, and maybe, for once, gain some grounds in this cat and mouse game that we've been seeing between the good guys and the bad guys. So these are the 3 points that I wanted to discuss in this webinar. I know that sometimes they seem a little bit controversial, and that's okay, because we are trying to have a change in the market, but I think we all understand that change is required. And again, the one statistic that we highlighted shows that doing things as we've done them so far makes no sense. We need to have a change. This is the change that we in Qualitas are proposing. So if we have any questions and any main objections, this is a great time to start the discussion.
Thank you, Uri. Before we go to Q&A, let's run a poll. So I will now select the poll. So everybody, you will see a poll appear on your screen. Please take a moment to participate. I'll just give you a couple more moments. Okay, thank you for your participation. The poll is now closed. There are some questions here for you, Uri. Question number 1. Can you clarify why you think non-security experts will be able to test for security vulnerabilities?
Yeah, sure. I think we touched upon this point, but it's very important that we elaborate a little bit. As I said, being in this industry for a while, I've seen how we've really defined and paved the road to understand what security really means. And very similar to any innovation S-curve, let's say, we see the initial process of the unknown, and where you need to have evangelists and very talented individuals trying to, in a way, hack the system and understand what needs to be done. And then it turns into a little bit more established practice, right? Where in our case, the security consulting firms had enough people, enough talent in-house, enough knowledge in-house to support the different industries and the differences also within these industries or sectors. But then at the end, we see where the domain is pretty much clear now to everyone. Industries know what to do and how to handle it. And they are doing it mostly themselves to a great level of confidence, building very strong infrastructures and frameworks in place to support the requirements that are needed in terms of security. But then something new comes along. Let's say in our case, it's the shift towards cybersecurity and whatever it means. It's a completely different webinar to discuss that as well. But everything that's been done so far has now been mainstreamed. And cybersecurity now, as the example, is the new thing, the IoT, the automotive industry, the wearables, whatever it is, and how we secure that has become the new thing. We need to remember that while this innovation is taking place, the traditional side of security and technology is still there and is still being perfected. So what we're seeing now is that, let's take web applications or mobile applications, testing for the big part of the vulnerabilities, the known vulnerabilities in these applications is now considered a very mainstream activity. And again, identifying a SQL injection or any type of an injection, it has different levels. And of course, that at the top level, you still need those very skilled cybersecurity experts in order to exploit these vulnerabilities. But what we are suggesting is not to take care of this top 10% of vulnerabilities. What we're suggesting is we take care of the 90% of the vulnerabilities that are there and easy to find and easier to exploit. And let's find these vulnerabilities using the tools and techniques that have been perfected over the last decade. So giving the tools, technique, and know-how at the hands of the testing experts will allow us again to get this consistency, to get this coverage that is currently almost impossible using the security experts because we are looking for a different mindset and asking them for having a different mindset, and because there are, bottom line, not enough security experts. So what we're suggesting is, just like any other testing field, let's say accessibility. If we look at accessibility a while ago, it was a niche area of testing that was done by niche testing companies. Today, it is an integral part of any testing activity. What we're suggesting is that security, to a large part of it, can be tested by these testing experts, and again, freeing the time for the cybersecurity experts to deal again with the cutting edge, with the things of tomorrow. And that's why I believe that testing experts have the capability and tools and frameworks in place to onboard cyber testing as well.
Thanks, Uri. So we're running short on time, but we have time for one more question. What role will security experts play post this shift?
I think they will play the role that they are meant to play, that they are designed to play, and the role that they have been playing at the beginning of this, I would say, domain. when this domain only started. And again, when we look at 10 years from now, we all understand that there are going to be dramatic leaps in terms of technology and innovation. Because if we look 15 years ago, we didn't even have smartphones. And now look where we are. So 10 years from now, we will definitely see those dramatic leaps in innovation. And if we talk about security, then I think security has several roles, right? First role, if we look at the day-to-day, is to protect our data and protect our privacy and all the things that are on a daily basis on the news. And then there's another level where security is a national interest. Can other nations interfere with our elections? Can security defend us from security attacks? So there is the national level. There is one more level, which is for me the most interesting level for security, and that's the responsibility of security to enable innovation. Because without the right level of security, none of us will go into a self-driving car, right? Or most of us will find it very difficult to bring in IoT devices that we know can start acting on their own. It is sometimes a psychological effect. It is sometimes a real concern. And the role of security is to make sure that innovation is built in a way that will allow people to adopt the innovation. Because without it, we can be as innovative as we want. If nobody will drive an autonomous car, then all the technology in the world would have been, invented in vain. As long as security supports innovation, then we can see how it contributes and adds value. And that's where I think the cybersecurity expertise should be aimed at. Not in finding those very well-defined set of vulnerabilities that are there for the taking. It's in thinking forward and helping innovators bring the innovation to a level that we all feel comfortable adopting.
Thanks very much. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you again to our presenter Uri Bar-El, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Just a reminder to keep a lookout for our email with today's webinar recording. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.